Hi, it's Marshall with the Restaurant Association of Maryland. And this week's segment, we are talking with Mike Whatley from the National Restaurant Association. And we're going to have a discussion about Initiative 82 in Washington, D.C. Now, typically, we don't get into policy discussions in these segments, but this one's kind of important. And we're getting a lot of questions because our association here in Maryland, we do have a lot of members that have locations and stores and restaurants within DC. So we're getting these questions. So I'm just going to preface this by saying this is not a Maryland event that has happened from the policy side. This is Washington, DC. But we do think it's important just to kind of bring it up. So Mike Whatley from the National Restaurant Association, go ahead and just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at the association.
Sure. So thanks for having me today. I am originally from the Maryland area, so I appreciate being a part of the conversation. I'm Mike Whatley. I'm Vice President of State Affairs and Grassroots Advocacy at the National Restaurant Association. And our team works with our state restaurant association partners in all 50 states plus DC and Puerto Rico on all legislative policy at the state and local level, and also manages the association's grassroots efforts at the federal, state, and local level. So we are very busy right now.
Absolutely. And we've been great, as everybody does know, we are great partners with the National Restaurant Association. And Mike and I have worked on a lot of things over the past couple of years. And we do the best that we can, right, Mike? And that's why we're here today to kind of explain what, as we just throw it around as 82. So what does Initiative 82 mean, and what exactly happened here?
So Initiative 82 was on the Washington, D.C. general election ballot at this point 2 weeks ago, and it would and it will eliminate the tip credit entirely in Washington, D.C. So starting in January, it will increase the cash wage for tipped employees up to $6 an hour, and then through a series of phase-ins will eventually eliminate the tip credit entirely in Washington, D.C. by July of 2027 and bring it up to the overall minimum wage. There are a couple of technical hoops that it has to kind of be checked off until it officially becomes law. But this was passed by voters, and it passed by a wide margin. 74% were in favor of it. So it's definitely a big challenge for the industry in Washington, D.C. going into the future. But it did pass, and we and other partners are planning on figuring out the impact and what it means for operators and tipped employees going forward.
Okay, so Mike, we all have kind of short memories, right? And we kind of forget how these things happen. But to my recollection, back in 2018, we had a similar thing here in Maryland, and servers and tipped employees came out in droves and testified at the Maryland General Assembly, and ultimately that didn't go anywhere. Washington, D.C., several years ago, as you said, did the same thing. Servers and bartenders and other tipped employees talked to their elected officials, and it did not pass. Just recently, Portland up in Maine had an initiative like this, did not pass. And then jurisdictions all across the country, servers and tipped employees say they don't want this. So, what happened? How and why did this happen in D.C.?
DC, I think, is a challenging market, and also we're fairly optimistic, a unique market regarding this issue. So to your point, yes, this was a major topic here in DC back in 2018. Initiative 77, as many of your members who operate in DC or the suburbs might remember, was on the general election ballot back in 2018, and it would have eliminated the tip credit in DC back then. After a very robust campaign in which tipped employees came out by the hundreds, operators had signs and buttons displayed in all of their restaurants across the district. The initiative did pass, but by a very slim margin, 55%. And there was such an outpouring of support after that election in favor of preserving the tip credit that the DC Council actually took action to overturn Initiative 77 and restore the tip credit in Washington, D.C. Now, while that's interesting, it also has a lot of impact on what recently happened with 82. So there was a backlash in Washington, D.C. regarding what happened with the council overturning what voters had passed with 77. And there was a lot of kind of anger that was still built up towards the council for what happened there amongst certain voting segments in D.C. Fast forward to 2022, you have this ballot initiative that began pending in the early part of 2022, collecting signatures. There were a couple of lawsuits back and forth in terms of signature gathering requirements, and it wound up being on the general election ballot. Now, why did things change? Why did this pass by a larger margin in DC than it did last time? It's a number of factors. I would say operator and tipped employee fatigue. We just dealt with this issue here in Washington, D.C. 4 years ago, and it was a very robust campaign back then. Many operators were cautious about speaking out on this issue again. Many tipped employees were cautious about speaking out on this again. Many tipped employees who advocated for the tip credit back in 2018 either have left the industry or moved out of the area or changed jobs. And so there wasn't as much of an organic tipped employee market or coalition as there was back in 2018. Some operators back in 2018 decided, look, the ballot initiative was overturned, the tip credit was reinstated, but there was this thinking that, this might change in the future. So I'm going to move to a service charge already and kind of quote unquote get ahead of this issue. So you had a number of kind of complicating factors here in DC that led to just a different environment and different campaign than it was in 2018. To your point, Marshall, voters in Portland, Maine just dealt with this issue on the same day as 82 and voted to preserve the tip credit. So voted against that ballot initiative. But DC was just a very challenging market. I think arguably a very unique market given the history from 2018. And it just kind of created a different environment.
Yeah. So, and I mean, we heard loud and clear back in 2018 when we had our servers here in Maryland testifying that, they all felt that they made significantly more money under the existing model. And they had no interest in going to an issue where they were paid a flat wage and that a service charge was added and all of these different changes that would need to happen. So let's talk about that a little bit. Do you think that, ultimately the DC voters know exactly what they voted for? Do you think they need an education campaign to understand that a service charge is not a tip and that they're likely going to see that on their bill? Menu prices are likely going to increase, and service may ultimately suffer because of non-tipped opportunities for servers.
I have to give kudos to your peers in DC with the Restaurant Association, Metropolitan Washington. They ran a great campaign, and I think raised this issue with the public. The Washington Post editorial board came out against the initiative and agreed with us in terms of the importance of the tip credit. So awareness was raised, but the tip credit is such a complicated issue, especially when it's put before voters, that I don't think a decent chunk of the voting populace knew what they were voting for. They probably thought they were voting for an overall increase of the minimum wage, which this was not. So I think there definitely will need to be and is going to be an education campaign in terms of what this means, the difference between a gratuity versus a service charge, why things may start to look different in the DC market in terms of perhaps some restaurants are going to have fewer staff or move to more kind of kiosks or tabletop computers for ordering. Things are going to change, and I think the industry is going to have to explain why this happened and that, look, this wasn't our decision. We campaigned against it, but in the end, voters decided to move in this direction. But there will be significant consequences for employees, for customers, and for operators.
Absolutely. We see it that way. Do you see the best servers in DC deciding to maybe go to a different jurisdiction, start waiting tables here in Maryland, or ultimately going to Northern Virginia because they're not willing to give up a $40 an hour job for, what is going to be significantly less without tips?
I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens. The market in DC will take a little while to transition and figure this out because the tip credit does not go away overnight. It's a phase in, but major decisions are going to be made by operators soon that are going to change the environment for customers, but certainly employees. And DC, DC is not an island by itself. I mean, you have Montgomery County, you have Prince George's County, you have Arlington, where I'm a resident, that are right across the way. And many operators may choose to open in those environments instead, depending upon what happens with service charges and other aspects of the business. Many tipped employees may decide to move to those jurisdictions instead. It's going to be a wait and see game in terms of what happens, but it's definitely going to be a challenging next couple of years here in DC as tipped employees adjust, as operators adjust, and as the customer base kind of figures out what's happening.
Yep. Well, Mike, I'm going to just kind of close with this, just to remind our Maryland folks that back in 2018, when the General Assembly passed an increase in the minimum wage here in Maryland, as part of that, our association advocated for placing on the pay stub for every tipped employee what their actual hourly wage calculated to with tips. And this way, every employee knows exactly what they're making per hour, that they understand and they can physically see that, no, I'm not making less than minimum wage. I am making $40 an hour or $25 an hour, or whatever the case might be. And that's something that we felt was important so that we could show and be very transparent about how our industry operates, especially with tipped employees. Because like you said, it's a little nuanced and complicated for those that are not in the industry, but ultimately it is the employees who benefit. And we just wanted to make sure that became abundantly clear to everyone. So as we move ahead, we will see how things go in Washington, D.C., and we will keep an eye on them as a neighbor. Mike, any closing thoughts? I do want to thank you for joining us for this segment today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I would just say, whether it be this issue or a federal issue or a local issue, advocacy matters. So when Marshall and Melvin and the team put out the call to action on any issue, get involved, take action, take the time. Your voice is so important for all issues that are impacting the industry at all levels of government.
All right. And we'll close with that. As you can see on the screen, if you want to look at the National Restaurant Association website, you can go to restaurant.org, and certainly any questions can be directed to us here at the Restaurant Association of Maryland. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.